Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Definitive Analysis. And today we keep it going with the Philip K. Dick train here. And going to be looking at a story, discussing a story called The Minority Report, which clearly becomes the movie The Minority Report. Now, I'll try to be brief in everything that I do today because this is a very long story. There's quite a bit to say about it. I think one of the hardest things for me was finding a kind of tread throughout the story here, thematic ideas that really seem to hold some weight. But it's a tough story, right? It doesn't fit together perfectly like some stories maybe will. One thing I will say is I finished up this semester, and one thing I do with my 9th graders at the end of the semester is we watch The Minority Report. Why? I don't know. It's a good movie. It kind of caps off our look into pulp fiction and science fiction coming out of that whole business. So it kind of is a nice way to end the semester. But I'll tell you this. I watched the movie, and I've read this story maybe a long time ago, but not really to the point where I'm, spending a lot of time with it. And after watching the movie and coming to the story after that, I was so confused. The movie takes so much liberty and changes so many things that it's almost like its own thing. There's a few ideas, themes perhaps, and maybe some ideas linked to characters that overlap. But at the same time, they just do whatever they want with that story. It's crazy. One thing they include in the movie that is not included, not a part of the original short story here, is the idea of John, and in this story it's Lisa, I think in the movie it's Laura, but that they have a son together. There is no child here, right? There is no child. Maybe in some symbolic sense, but not a literal child that we have. So I'll get right into it. The Minority Report. Now, one of the big themes, perhaps the biggest theme in the text, is going to be old versus young, especially in the sense of burgeoning kind of competitions, old people feeling like they're being pushed out by younger people, which obviously has probably been the case for many centuries, right? Because the idea of getting old is you become less capable, and then there's these newer, hungrier people, more eager people ready to take your place, right? This younger generation. And we start off that way immediately in this story because we have Anderton, John Anderton, who is old. So important the way I kept coming back to these same first few lines. Bald, fat, and old, right? 3 good ways to understand Anderton and maybe his literal self, or at least his perception of himself. Now, this is going to be contrasted sharply right from the beginning with Witwer. Witwer is, not only does he have hair, but it's blonde hair, right? Which seems to kind of draw a lot of attention to itself. And he's young and he's eager and he's here to learn the ropes about this pre-crime industry so that eventually he can become a part of it. However, John, the older man in charge, and he is director, right? So he's acting director of this program. He had a lot to do with creating pre-crime, but he's very nervous. He's fearful. And I think that's probably the better word here. He is afraid. And there's not too much to really be afraid of. Maybe it's kind of leaning on the edge of a certain kind of anger and paranoia, maybe a certain kind of resentment on behalf of Anderton. Because right off the bat, second paragraph, Witwer is gracious, right? We get the word gracious associated with Witwer. So I think he's coming from a good place. Now, one thing I'll say, I love names. I look up the names. Witwer is widow. And we don't get any backstory on him. In the movie, they actually mention that I lost a wife. So they kind of take the name into effect. But here we don't. But I think, why do we have the idea of a widow? Remember that Lisa, John's wife, is, especially after you get through the story and you see how this all goes down, she is so important, right? Vital to John's journey, to dealing with the difficult aspects of this experience. And she's just this kind of stable partner, right? So I think we see that from the beginning here as well, as soon as we're introduced to her. But Witwer represents the idea of not having that person, right? A widower means you've lost that partner in life, that support, right? And things could be tougher without that. And John's lucky enough to have Lisa, really, throughout the entire story here. So I'll keep on going here. You see the literal fear, right, that touches him, and he begins to sweat right in the beginning here as he's first introduced to Witwer, right, face to face. A reference to the word blind here in the beginning, which speaks to really John's experience throughout most of the story, not knowing who to trust. There's a certain kind of blindness, right, that we see as a part of this. Talking about the ideas of ambition here for young people. Again, these are very universal themes. The idea that old people are filling these kinds of spaces, right, and earning the prestige and the salaries and the money and all these things, the lifestyle that comes with it, and yet are keeping younger generations from these positions, right? You hear a lot about this, the way we talk about boomers and older people having it easier, and of course the debate is out. You got to look up the research on these things to be exact, but you can see how these sentiments, right, prevail within societies generation after generation, right? Now, what I like about the story here, as far as Anderton's point of view goes on the work he does, right, working for Pre-crime, being this guy who really helped found the entire system, is you get a sense that he understands it's imperfect, that it's just kind of the way that it is, right? For instance, he says here to Witwer, and again, just kind of introducing him to the entire idea of pre-crime, but he says, Anderton says, we're taking individuals who have broken no law. He's reminding him that this is all predicated upon the idea that people really have not broken any actual laws, but that we can somehow predict through the pre-cogs, right, these, as they call them, mutants, something very inhuman, they tend to describe it, because they can see into the future in these fragmented ways, right, that they can then analyze as police detectives. It's a wonderful idea. You know, it reminds me of the last story I did. We can remember it for you wholesale, which leads to total recall. But I think that's where you might find some of the religious connections in this text, which I don't think are too paramount. I think those kind of sit in the background because there's these other themes like old versus young and some other universal themes that I think are dealt with more so in this story. But the whole idea of it is pretty cool. It kind of reminds us of like heavenly divine judgment and stuff, right? Knowing that somebody's going to do something bad. In this case, it's always violent crimes or treason, which is interesting because maybe there's a certain level of treason that takes place in the story when you think about the armies and the police and their kind of involvement with each other. But it's interesting idea here. Anderton knows this is kind of built on a system that is not perfect. As he says, in a sense, they are innocent, right? So he understands that perspective when looking at the work that pre-crime does and the results, right? The people that have been put away from society because of this. Now, major contrast to the film and the way they show the pre-cogs. They kind of show this idea of this distance between humans and the pre-cogs. We treat them separately. We don't let them have human lives. And that's a big theme within the film, right, that we see here. However, here, they're literally described as just idiots lost in a haze, right? Important idiots because of the visions that they provide. But I'll just read one line here. All day long, the idiots babbled, imprisoned in their special high-backed chairs, held in one rigid position by metal bands and bundles of wiring clamps. These are pretty almost kind of horrific images, right? People being restricted in such ways. And then it also mentions here that their heads are much bigger than their bodies, right? Perhaps because of the purpose and the existence that they have here. I think there is a way to understand older people, maybe even the elderly. We still keep going mentally well into our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even some of us well into our 80s. However, one thing that will definitely subside over the years and become more restrictive to us as people is going to be the physical aspects and capabilities of our lives. So older people, even though the wisdom is, fuming from our ears, at the same time, it's much harder to get around, and maybe we look at younger people and we start to be envious, right? And maybe even a little fearful of their capabilities compared to our own, right? Especially when we talk about people, into their 40s, 50s, 60s, those older ages here. We have wisdom, but we have no strength and energy. Right? And here's where we find out what pre-crime is preventing and doing a very good job of it, right? It's quite remarkable. But as he says here, we seldom get actual murder or treason. They do throw in the treason. And I think when you think about the story in totality, treason is a major theme here, right? Especially when we talk about the conflict between army and police, or the allegiances we have within these agencies. Keeping up with the plot, which can be difficult, I think, in this text because things fall back upon themselves. There's kind of these setups that take place, right? But we do have, it's alluded very clearly that we have two separate agencies. You have the army and then you have the police. And they seem to be at odds with one another, right? They seem to be vying for control, power, responsibility, and influence, right? That they really seem to be at odds with one another throughout this. And they are on an equal playing field when it comes to the pre-crime data, because as soon as something pops out at the police headquarters where John is director, the army is also getting the same images. Now, do they know what to do with these images? Are they as practiced and do they have the expertise to kind of sift through this? That's another question, but they're getting the same information, right? And that seems to be probably kind of a federal mandate, right? That the army be in control of some of this, be able to access this information. And it happens only like 2.5, 3 pages into the story, but we get the data. Out comes the card, and we see pre-crime commissioner, I've been saying director, but Commissioner Anderton, right, is going to kill a man. The name Anderton, I'm not sure if I mentioned it right off the bat, but it's a son of Andrew, right, is the translation of that. So we look at what Andrew means, which is strong, manly, and brave. And those are the attributes of being a man, both old and young, right, that everybody's striving to live up to. Strong, manly, and brave. And I think when you read this story, you have to be thinking about John in that type of manner. Is he able to act in a decisive masculine way? Is he clouded by hesitation and doubt? Is he able to make decisive decisions? That's what we might be looking for based on the name here. And out comes his name. He is going to kill somebody, right? And this is, from what I understand, perfect Philip K. Dick kind of setup, where you have somebody from the inside, especially somebody like the commissioner who has this very high position, right? Very involved, has a lot of perks to the position, right? A lot of access. And here his name comes up as somebody who's essentially kind of perpetrating against the system, right? How dare you premeditate murder, right? Have the idea of premeditated murder when you know that pre-crime is something that's out there, right? Something that's going to catch you. So very ironic, right? That he would show up as a suspect here. And not even a suspect, somebody who's already been accused, right? Based on what the pre-cogs have found. And so sets up the story. What have the pre-cogs found, right? And we keep on going here. Part 2 of the story starts off with Lisa, and she is just wonderful. The name Lisa is kind of like Elizabeth, which translates to, I see this over and over in stories, God is my oath. And I think she is very much a religiously imbibed character that comes with a sense of goodness, a sense of devotion. You see that John has his major doubts about Lisa's culpability and everything that he's dealing with. major distrust issues, but she is here and she is solid, right? And that's what's wonderful about Lisa. Not to say too much else at this point. This is very cool. John's thinking, how do I just get this all to go away? How do I make this problem disappear? And this, I'll just read the sentence. His original impulse to tear open the machines and remove all the data was uselessly primitive. And that's where the primitive is so important, because that's what this is all about. Violence, murder. And not just murder that's premeditated, but also murder that's kind of in the heat of the moment. But what is really preventable with pre-crime and seeing people's thoughts and understanding things is the premeditated stuff, right? So that's been largely phased out. But that's very primitive, the act of killing, right? And notice his impulse is to tear open the machines, which is to say, in life as animals, our impulse is to tear at each other, right? Especially when we have conflict. And maybe this is just already foreshadowing the types of conflicts we'll see throughout this short story. But it's the primitive in us. It is the original impulse of what we are as animals, right? And that connects to, I think, some of the ideas we were talking about in We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, right? In the other episode. The story is, I think, taking place in Chicago, yet again, just like We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, a very populous city. One thing this story, another big theme to this story is rich and affluent with lifestyles of convenience and abundance versus those who have very little. And what I love about that is the thematic relevance to our own day and age, when 60% of Americans don't have even $1,000 somewhere for an emergency of any kind, right? Transportation, medical, you name it, right? So it reminds us of the haves, the really, really steady haves, and the steady have-nots, right? And these two different sections of life. And I think even the film Minority Report does this a little bit, mostly through the chase scenes. When they're doing their chase scenes, that's when we see some interesting shots of people in more cramped conditions compared to like John, especially the end of that movie where you see him in like the ballrooms, right, of the police agencies and stuff. So that's another major theme I just want to really shed light on early on here. He refers to Witwer as a creature, right, in the state of fear. This person's out to get my job. And I think, real quick, yet again, that's just a way of tying us back to the primitive, right? We are all creatures, right? Which means who knows what we'll do, right? The monsters that we can become. And just to bring that one step forward, especially monsters who are filled with a sense of fear and resentment, right? Those can be even worse, which I think might fit John's character here early on in the story. Very fearful, especially now that his name's popped up. And how does this happen? How did this end up happening? He's going to become very fearful, suspicious, paranoid, right? Which maybe it's the natural tendency. So his immediate thoughts, and this is important thematically, but his immediate thought is to blame Witwer. Witwer's behind this, right? He somehow made this happen so that my name popped up because he wants my job, he wants my position. And there's the fear of the older man having, of the younger man, right? The older man's fear of the younger man and how badly he wants to take his place. The good term might be the usurper, right? He who usurps, the other takes over, right? Pushes him off the way. Think of it like a king of the hill type of scenario, right? Somebody, the older person's going to have to really do a good job defending it because all these younger people are ready to push him down, right? However, I want to make sure we contrast that with Witwer's a nice guy. There's nothing so far in the story, right? In fact, you go back to the first couple pages, you see a lot of gracious diction used to describe him early on. So that's nice to see, right? This doesn't really make sense in terms of reality, but then that's the power of our minds here, right? The fear and the paranoia that can start to overcome an older person. Here, when he's in this frantic state of mind, he thinks about like just running away and fleeing. And I love that, right? That you've been framed, right, for this future. You think you're being framed for this future murder, right? And instead of actually killing someone, you're in causing that kind of damage and harm, based on this information, the only thing you think to do is run away from any potential involvement, right? So it's the exact opposite of what is said to be, right, the future and what would happen here. But it really produces quite an opposite effect, which I just find very ironic here. Now, here, in this frantic state of mind, he's thinking about, where can I go, right? Where can I hide out? And he mentions the Centaurian colony planets. The Centaurian colony planets. And I haven't thought about too much of the importance of this idea of colony. Maybe that's not necessary. But Centaurian, you think of a centaur, you think of the half man, half horse. And that could be it. And you ask why, right? What's the importance of half man, half horse? Well, I'll tell you what. I would like to think of myself, and maybe you might think the same, of the power that I'm capable of having, especially when my younger days, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, I take good care of myself. I got a sore foot right now, but I take good care of myself. So even now I would say I tend to feel this way. But I am a man, but I'm also an animal with power, right? When you think about horses and the power, they're the beasts of burden that they are. There's a sense of power and virility and real capability, physical capability. And remember, that's what's lacking. Go back to the first couple lines of this story: fat and old and bald, right? And feeble, and starting to feel very incapable, right? In our physical form. And that will come. That comes for all of us. It's kind of a sad fact of life. But here, we have the opposite of that, right? Is going back to this idea of being very capable. All right. And that's what he's hoping would be best case scenario right now. Can I just get away from this? His wife reminds him, there has been no indication that you're going to be killing Ed Witwer, right? No indication. So how do you even know that that's the case, right? That that's going to be, that that's what you're running from. And then we find out the actual name here. And the actual name, spelled out very clearly for us here, is Leopold Kaplan, right? Leopold Kaplan. And Leopold is Leo, right? And brave people, bold ruler. So there's one name that we associate with this character. And here's the other one, Kaplan, which is chaplain or a curator, also could be tiger. And this is the murder victim, right? The future murder victim. And the funny, ironic thing here is, of course, John has never heard of this person ever before, right? And the movie does take the name Leo. They make the person that John's going to kill Leo Crow, so it's a little different here, but they do hold on to the name Leo. All right, just to point that out. All right, now we do get a nice symbol here. I can't say there's a ton of clear, symbolism throughout the story, but I like this. I like this. As he's kind of getting ready to move on to the next place here, right? He clutches a weather-stained winter sports jacket. All right, and I think that's a weather-stained sports jacket, right? Something that's just been through all the conditions day after day, right? It's a mess. And I think this is a metaphor for youth, almost like the old football jacket that's been through it all, right, in those younger days. And more so, it represents a body on earth that is all used up. It's been through the years, it's been through the decades. Think of your body in that way, right? And that's why you got to take good care of yourself. Because it is getting worn, right, through the ages here. So it's a metaphor, I think, essentially for John, right? For older people in general who are starting to deal with these physical incapabilities in life, and they feel the next generation rising up, right? The breath on their necks, so to speak. And here he is, Leopold Kaplan, General, which I think is about as high as it gets, General of the Army of the Federated West Bloc Alliance. Interesting to see West Bloc. I mean, that almost sounds like Soviet language, but I could be off on that. But this is the head of the army, essentially, right? One of the major heads of the military, within the context of this story, of course. And he is a major military decorated individual, right? Major. Now, where's the rub, right, for John? It really comes in, here he is being convicted of future murder, right, by his own system, pre-crime, which he has to be a firm supporter of, right? He's the one who helped build it up, and the future of pre-crime depends on its accuracy, right, and does it work? And so in a way, he can't just come out and say, I never intended to kill you, right? Or that will totally invalidate the work that pre-com does with the visions and everything that they have here, and they say it's so accurate, right? And he says here, as he's engaged with Kaplan, needless to say, there is no murder or intent to murder. And so in a way, he's admitting, right, that this system doesn't work here. And Kaplan's going to seem to jump upon that point, right, as they continue their discussion. Anderton here expresses some of the distrust that he has toward his wife, right, which makes sense. But at the same time, maybe there should be more trust, and maybe that's something that has to be learned here, maybe through experience. But maybe we should have more trust in certain individuals here. Somehow Kaplan gets the word, right? Who knows? He's got a network of informants, I'm sure. But now, because Anderton has been accused of this future murder, he's been essentially wiped clear of his position, right? Wiped clean of it. And now Witwer, who was kind of already ready to jump into in some capacity, young as he is, eager as he is, passionate as he is, he's now jumping into that position. And this is going to make John feel even more paranoid, perhaps more powerless, knowing that this guy is already in that position. There are 2 times, I think, in the entire long short story that we actually get the middle name for John. And the full name here is John Allison Anderton. All right. And John, I don't want to talk too much about. You know, there's always St. John the Baptist or stuff, and I'm not ready to make those kind of, you know, firm connections to this story. But one thing I think I can say about Allison, I've already talked about Anderton a little bit, but Allison is it is a unisex name, there's always that, but more importantly, it represents nobility. And notice that's kind of where John starts, right? Police commissioner, way up. He is a part of the upper echelon of these police forces, which seems to entail a certain kind of lifestyle and luxury. I think the movie, again, does a good job of getting that across as well. But now, like so much PKD fiction, we have this wonderful fall from grace. Right? Now you've been implicated. Now you are being chased. Now you are going to have to explore the underbelly of society in a book. And I'll put a link here that I do have some lectures for definitive analysis is Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. It's a beautiful text, a beautiful novel by Philip K. Dick. And it explores some of those themes, right? So from way up here, and now you fell, and you're going to have to find your way through this. And of course, it's going to be character changing, right? That's the whole idea. All right, moving forward. Chapter 4, like I said, gotta love the irony. You are accused of murder, literally, right? Being there and doing something to somebody. And now that you know that, and you're trying to prevent it, you're literally just running away, right? Running away from it, which seems like the most peaceful thing that you could do ever, right? Once you are somehow made aware of that information. Anyways, moving on here. And John's starting to understand, if my story, you know, kind of comes to fruition, I'm an innocent man that's been accused of pre-crime, then that's it, right? As he says, pre-crime goes wrong, right? And it's going to totally invalidate the whole system that he's kind of built up an entire reputation on for a long time. I like this line just because of how much I think it hits home if you've ever watched like a PKD biography and you know about some parts of his life, some events in his life. But it says here, In fact, he was almost ready to concede that he was the victim of a weary, neurotic fantasy spawned by growing insecurity. That could easily be a description of Philip K. Dick at certain points in his life, right? Which is interesting. I think he writes that in here a little bit once in a while to remind us, right, about the fact that this can be quite personal, right? And also providing a kind of writer's perspective on all of this. Now, the next thing that happens comes out of nowhere, right? You can see this image before your eyes, but something skids in front of the road, and basically it's a bread truck, right? And they crash right into it as he's being escorted, basically back to the police station, I believe, right? Where they're just gonna like put him back in jail and hand him over to the authorities, to Witwer, right? Which is what it seems. But there's this bread truck that slams in. Now, why bread? Thematically, I think bread is abundance, right? Reminds me of what I heard a comedian talking about on YouTube, and just what is Grubhub and so many of these delivery industry, delivery companies. What do they deliver? Carbs, right? Just carbs. And what is bread? Carbs. It's what we want a lot of. If you're starving, you want a little bit of bread. If you want to have it good, you want a lot of bread, right? And that's maybe why we call money bread, right? Colloquially. So I think that's the idea, right? Coming in here, we get this kind of idea of abundance. And boy, does it cause a commotion. They crash, right? Now somebody basically emerges out of that vehicle and takes Anderton away. All right, and says, we don't have a lot of time. I'm here to help you. I'm going to help you escape from Kaplan's clutches here, the army. Right? I'm going to help you get out of here. Now, one thing I think, of course, it's a major plot point in the story. It explains, and more to say about this later, but symbolically, I think, yeah, the connection to bald, fat, and old, right? There are a lot of bald, fat, old men who have a lot of bread. Let's just put it that way, especially here where I live in Southern California, right? They got a lot of bread. A life of bread and abundance. But again, thinking about John and older men in general, growing futility or purposelessness, right? You're sitting on this pile of bread. It makes me think of like Scrooge McDuck. I grew up watching DuckTales, sitting on that pile of money, but it's such a feeble part of his life, right? Not maybe able to move too much. And I think he walks around with a cane, if I'm not mistaken, right? Anyways, here, the name of this character that is a part of this kind of smash and grab, right? Helping John get out of here is Fleming. Man from Flanders is what it translates to. It makes me think of Flanders from The Simpsons. Belgium, right, which is a place in Belgium. I don't know how helpful that is, honestly. But one of the details that's mentioned about Flanders maybe a few times is he's a fat man, right? He is a fat man. And that's where we can start to link certain characteristics back to John himself, who has these ideas of being an old, fat, bald man, right? So I think we found a connection point. And we're going to see some things about Fleming as he comes trying to help him out, all right? John catches himself, even amidst this accident and stuff. It may be because of the accident. Again, remember the idea of bread and abundance. And you're trying to protect that, right? As an older person, you're trying to protect all that. And he reflects after the accident, hostility toward Witwer, right? Immediately when I learned I was going to kill somebody, my immediate thought was it's going to be that young, capable man who's going to take my job. Notice the level of resentment that went into that first thought. But then he's realizing, but that was overwhelming me, right? That thought was taking over. And he says, hostility toward Witwer replaced my wife and younger man, natural resentment. And there is the natural resentment, right? So you can see his natural resentment made him think that it was Witwer from the beginning, but it wasn't. And I think that's where he has to slow it down and start to recognize that natural resentment is leading me in the wrong direction here, right? And I have to start thinking differently here. All right. He gets these false identification cards, right? So that he can elude the army and some of these people that maybe are trying to get their hands on him, right? The police force as well, because he's trying to avoid everybody. The name we get is Ernest Temple. Now, Ernest probably speaks to earnesty, right? Maybe along religious lines, right? A sense of seriousness, a earnest desire to learn the errors of his ways. And temple, I think probably, we think of it in a religious context. It's such a specific name to come out of this, right? Probably speaks to transformation and redemption. And we've reached that part of the story where he has declined to the state of a out-of-work electrician, right? So somebody who's barely able to survive within the society. What do we connect that to? I said it earlier. The current fact that the bottom 60% of current-day Americans, which is the overwhelming majority of our country, has less than $1,000 in the bank to get through life, right? And emergencies that might come their way. And trust, the emergencies come our way, right? So now that he's down here, the redemptive aspects of his life can begin, right? The rejuvenation, the new person to come out of this. And there's an earnestness to change, right? We really desire it, we truly want it, and we're going to work toward it. I think that's a pretty nice way of thinking about the next section as it picks up. All right, here's where we start to get some description of the philosophical kind of configurings of pre-crime. But I think it also maybe applies to some social issues as well. So it says here, the existence of a majority logically implies a corresponding minority. Okay, makes sense. If there's a majority, there has to be a minority. Now, that's going to deal with the reports that come from these pre-crime pre-cogs, and there's 3 of them. All right, so there's one way of applying this. The other, I think, is like society in general. There is the majority of people, and the majority doesn't necessarily mean the economically fortunate. Notice I just spout out that 60%, which means that the majority in this country are not economically fortunate to the point where they don't have $1,000 in the bank for emergencies. Maybe it hasn't always been so topsy-turvy, right, with the numbers there. Maybe at some point the affluent was the majority, but now simply they are the minority. But I think in any way you're going to look at it, you have to remember there is another group of people living in your society with you. So while you might be living in a good house and you're able to make ends meet and you got money in the bank and you're doing what you can and you're going on vacations or whatever it is, 101 ways to spend your money, right, within this world we live in. Other people aren't. Other people are on the bottom, barely scraping by, wishing there was more governmental assistance, and there's clearly none, right? Hoping for an opportunity that's going to come their way. And so it reminds us of the empathy and the sensitivity that's needed, right? To think of others. There's always a minority as well. So I think that's another way of understanding the inclusion of that text there. He's in this hotel, and it is a scant religious kind of existence. You see the language, gratefully. He locked the door, right? The room was small but clean, very sparse. It reminds me of the end of Sherwood Anderson's Hands with Wing Biddlebaum, right? He's picking up the crumbs off the floor and eating every last bite in his very minimalistic environment, right? Which is the life of Christ, right? Which is a life of poverty, essentially. And he's living that here, the simplicity, that idea of being meager. One thing I think I really do appreciate about this particular short story, because I think other novels don't do it. I feel like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? There's the empathy box and like Mercerism and stuff, and it's vaguely explained. But I feel like in this story, he goes out of his way to really describe like the philosophy and the logic behind the way they put all the precog data together. And basically, they got 2 of them. They got 3 of them all together. You got Jerry, you got Donna, and you got Mike. All right. And 2 of them will essentially provide their visions, and then the 3rd one will overlook both of their visions and provide kind of an alternative final vision, right, to that. And that is how the majority report is obtained, actually, through that 3rd precog, right, and the data that they essentially spit out. So it gets confusing, I think, pretty quickly, pretty easily. But I think Phil K. Dick does try to really provide the detail of how this all works throughout the short story. And I guess they had to kind of create a reason to have this pre-crime in the first place. And they didn't just want to leave it up to chance any longer. People might commit violent acts. They might not. and leaving it up to essentially God's will, is kind of one way of understanding that, right? You're not going to try to intervene and get in the way here. And he admits that that is one way of doing it, but then there wouldn't be a need for pre-crime, and so therefore we have to essentially collect these visions, right? Sift through these visions and find a way to corroborate the material and make a real kind of accusation, right, based on these things, so that we can prevent any violence or treason within our society. The guy, one of the smaller minor characters who's helping out with this is Page. The last name Page is, you think about a page like within the world of government, they tend to be young, right? They're like entry-level positions, youthful, child, and attendant, right? So it's reminding us of the other side of the age spectrum, right? The young and the very eager and promising, perhaps. And when we start off section 6, you can see right away, between noon and 1 o'clock, the rubbish-littered streets swarmed with people. We are back with humanity. And it doesn't have to be like this humanity that's brimming with goodness and, green grass and beautiful blue skies. It's humanity nonetheless, right? The griminess of it, the decrepit aspects of it, the beauty of it. But the important thing here is we've taken a police commissioner who usually sits up in like a high castle all day, or a high tower. You think of from Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, the police commissioner, right? That the second half of that book really focuses on. But it's taken that person who's so closed off in that tower, and now they are brought down to the city streets, right? And they are vulnerable, and they will learn from this experience, right? So I think it's really nice imagery, right? With that reminds us of that theme. As John sneaks back into the agency, right, and starts to make some contact here with people he knows. Luckily, Page is still there, because what he finds out is Witwer is actually starting to cycle out some of the older employees, right? Which reminds us of that theme, right? The new guys and girls coming to get the old people's jobs, right? Everybody's starting to swarm in here. And that's going to make Jerry feel probably more, John feel more on edge here. Page shares here a little bit of information about Witwer. And the line here is, Witwer is making hay, hand over fist. The hay kind of reminds me of that whole aspect of the horse and just that idea of strength. And to make hay, we don't really use that expression too much these days, but to make hay means to take full advantage of a situation. And that's what he's doing, right, as somebody as capable as he is. I tell you, it's beautifully eerie, the descriptions of these precogs. And that's where the movie goes and ruins it, in my opinion. And I get it. Nobody wants to see this on screen. It's much cooler like that they're in like a hot tub, right, described as milk. And I like the themes they do with that, the milk and the nourishment, the lack of mother, right, getting back to a mother. The precog loses a mother there. Here it's just like they are bundled in with wires and circuits, and they are just strapped in, right? Much creepier. But I love it. One of them we take a little bit of a look at here is Jerry. Jerry, short for Gerald. And Gerald translates to, I love this, I'll put another link here. This is The Kindly Isle by Frederick Pohl. Main character's name is Jerry there. It means tip of the spear, or actually to rule by spear. And the spear was like the most formidable weapon when you think of the ancient world. Even the the Romans. That's how the army just owned shop, right? Is the use of the spear, right? That's how they did it. The sword was more like, it's just kind of cool to see in the images. It would come later, maybe for certain, soldiers, but it was the spear. So it's interesting to get that name here when we think about what it means to be protective and defensive. You better get the spear out, right? But maybe it's not used in that way, I'll have to say. And it's hard to get any sense of sympathy. The movie does a good job with that. But here I don't think it's intended. I'll just read one last line here. It says, Jerry, however, remained in the aimless chaos of idiocy, just entrapped within his visions of the future, and not even knowing what to do with that or what to think, really, right? Just that's what you're looking at all day long. Kind of reminds you of like the YouTube testers, and people have to like watch content before it's cleared for upload, and they tend to see a lot of crazy stuff. But this, of course, is future visions and stuff. And so what John is essentially doing here is removing certain data, checking it over to see if there's anything that suggests otherwise, right? That he is not predetermined to commit this murder. And he finds one. And what it is it's showing a future in which John sees that he's going to commit a murder, and from that point makes the decision not to commit a murder. And there's another card, right? So he is not going to do this, as kind of evidenced by one of the precogs here, right? So it's really probably the best situation that John could ask for. And then right at the end of the scene, what we find is Lisa, and it even says, as she's helping him escape, the slim figure of his wife. The slim is to be contrasted with the idea of fatness, right? As it kind of associates with the older, right, people in life. And she helps him escape, right? That devotion is clearly there. So even in this predicament, she's going to help him get away. And as they, in their escape, they're going over the rural countryside here. And again, it's described as war-ravaged. And as imagistic as that maybe is, and there's not much detail really provided beyond that, it's more thematic, right? As human beings, we've already destroyed ourselves. Here we have this pre-crime agency that can stop violent crimes from being committed. But think about soldiers, and I think that's maybe why Philip K. Dick brings in the idea of military, maybe police to some extent, but definitely military. It's all about murder. It's all about, in fact, it's the weirdest sense of premeditated murder you're ever going to find, because you don't even know the victim you're going to be going out for. You just belong to one side of the conflict. There's another side. You know you're going to be killing people. I hate to be so stark about it, right? But I think that is the reality. So there's a lot of premeditated murder. It's an unfortunate, massive amount of premeditated murder in the world, and you can find it on the battlefields of days of the past and the current age as well, right? It's really unfortunate. So I think that's more thematic, almost as a sense of exposition, right? What we've been through, who we've already been as a people. We find out about Kaplan in the military agency here, and he's part of like an old boys club, let's put it, old military boys club, I'll put it that way. It's an exclusive veterans organization. And when you think veterans, not only do you think war, you should also think older men and women, right? But especially men, especially when we go back into the World War I and II eras, right? And even Vietnam, there was barely any women in military. Nowadays, maybe a little bit different of a story. You tell me the numbers, right? You can do the research. But this is an old men's club here, right? And they do a lot to keep themselves relevant. And I guess that's true of old men in our current society. They do a lot to keep the idea of their power and their kind of influence within this world very viable, right? And so they got a big mansion of a house in New York where they kind of like have meetings and stuff. They got glossy paper publications and occasional TV coverage that cost them a small fortune. So they pump a lot of money into keeping themselves relevant. And I think that's an interesting way to think about the kind of WASP community, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Is that what they're doing nowadays, right? Is pumping a lot of money into maintaining a certain kind of stature within our society. And Lisa brings up a good point, and again, I don't think John's going to disagree. Maybe a lot of people are like you. They've been accused of a future crime, a future violent act, and maybe somewhere in the data there was a readout that they wouldn't have committed that. But this is something that was either superseded or overlooked. And the point will be made, the only reason John was able to kind of get on top of this was because he is involved in the agency itself, right? He has access to the information that's coming out of these precogs. So he's very, very, very fortunate. And she makes the point that a lot of other people out there, right? The citizens themselves, who is a big part of this story, right? Citizenry, right? The people out there. They maybe have been taken advantage of, right? Or mistreated in that sense. Now, this is where Lisa brings up a difficult question, I think, for John, for all of us reading this and analyzing this text. But she says, if pre-crime is going to survive, and she stands by pre-crime. I think that's one thing we recognize about both John and Lisa. They are strong proponents of the agency that they work for, right? They really believe in it. They're going to put their lives on it. But she says, in order for pre-crime to survive, you're going to have to kill Kaplan. You're going to have to follow through with the prediction here, right? Or it's going to invalidate the whole system. And I think what this does is, what's more important, the individual and his sense of safety and staying out of prison, not being accused of something that you really feel like you're not going to do here, right? It's an unfairness. Or what's more important, protecting the system that you are a part of. And that system could be anything. For some of us, it might be family. I will take the rap for something in order to protect my family, right? And I'll be the one to suffer the pains and the discomforts of whatever I have to deal with, as long as they stay safe. Some of us might do that for the companies that we work for. Some of us might do that for the political parties that we belong to. The list goes on and on, right? Can you put something bigger than yourself? In this case, for John, it would be the police agency, right? And the work he does there, the life he's had there. Is that more important than your own life? So I think she brings up a really interesting theme there for him. Now, not a lot of straightforward, spontaneous action in the story outside of what? The car crash, right? With the bread truck. Here comes the next one. And it's a very revealing part of the story, because at this point, everything seems to be a mystery. But here comes Fleming in their airplane, right, that they're in. Lisa's actually, flying an airplane here. And Fleming scrambled instantly to his feet. He was hiding out in this plane. And his arm lashes out for the woman's pistol. And then he basically takes hold of her, right? And he says something weird. I don't make too much of this. Oh, one more thing I want to mention here before I get too far removed from it. After Lisa gives him this kind of this speech about putting yourself, putting the system that you belong to before yourself, right? Which, getting rid of that sense of like invidiousness, that it's just about you as an individual. There's a bigger purpose here. It's described as, the diction here is sermon. So it does take on a kind of religious messaging at that point, right? This is a moralistic and ethical concern, right? That you really need to be taking seriously. Remember, this is supposed to be a redemptive transformation, the fall from something mighty to a more kind of humble and doubtful kind of, place in life. And now we're doing the learning here, and the sermons are coming out. And it makes sense that it would come from Lisa, because the name translates to oath, an oath of God, right? Now back to this whole situation with Fleming attacking Lisa, all right? He says something weird. He says, I thought she might talk more, that's why I waited. Wouldn't you not wait if you thought she was going to talk more and reveal more of the plan? So that was that I don't know if it's just the way that it's written, but that's a little strange to me, right? And here, Fleming is going to say Kaplan is working directly with Witwer, right? And you got no one to really trust in all of this, except for me, right, Fleming. And he gets that gun away from Lisa. And what I love about this story, too, is it totally departs from the idea. I just read a story. I read an old... the name escapes me just because I'm not too familiar, but some old pulp detective fiction. It was a really good story. I really liked it. But in there, they have the secretary, who really is so one-dimensional. She's the softer side of this lawyer's life, who goes out and gets into all kinds of trouble, right? And then he comes back, and there's this softness and this, maternalistic quality of this woman that never departs. And I think we already talked about Lisa's devotion, but one thing that stands out here too is she's active, she's agile, she's supportive in various ways, right, when it comes to John. She's not just the damsel in distress, is maybe the best way to put it. But Fleming pulls out a bigger gun, a heavy-duty military weapon, which might tell us something. Well, if he's supposed to be affiliated with the police forces, right, these protective agencies there, why has he got military-grade weapons, right? And he says, I told you she was at the back of the whole thing. So he's trying to tell John, Lisa's been behind this the whole time, right? You can't trust her. You cannot trust her. And remember, what is Fleming? Fleming is, we've been described as fat, which ties us to old and bald, right? And there's the old. Don't trust women, right? Don't trust women. That reminds me of those chimpanzees that you see. I remember watching something where they totally start to be very antagonistic toward the women within their communities, right? It was either orangutans or chimps, and they were like in their 30s and 40s toward the end of their older male lives, and they get vicious toward the women. Fleming declares that he comes from a kind of protective society. His hands are plump. There's that fatness. Other characters, especially Lisa and I think Witwer, are described as lean, agile, capable. There's that younger kind of build. And maybe it's not just the physicality of it, but the sense we have about ourselves, that we can still be that type of force within the world, right? Instead of something more kind of lethargic here and oppressive, perhaps. But anyways, you see that here, right? You shouldn't have trusted this woman. And then it gets taken to a whole nother level here. And he says the first thing is to get this woman out of the way, and he's ready to essentially choke her, right? He even says, we'll have to drag you completely out of this area. So Fleming basically starts to put his, and I'll just read this. He expertly tilted her chin up until her temple was shoved back against the seat. And so he actually gives Anderton the gun while he's about to dispose of Lisa. Let's not forget, this is Anderton's wife. Not that we get a lot of backstory about their relationship, right, and how close they are, but they seem pretty close, pretty devoted to each other, especially with the backdrop being this police agency that they work for. But to think, here, hold this gun while I kill your wife, it's kind of sensational, right? It's crazy. Within a society which maybe the public is not so aware of, but you have the police and then you have the army, and they seem to be vying for control, right? And I think the good relationship to think about is you get power, then you get to take over responsibility, right? That means you're taking responsibility. We have to look over this district and this district. Now we're looking over these aspects of people's lives, but with that, once you get that responsibility and everything's in place, comes the control, right? Maybe that's what the army here is after. They contact Witwer and basically are going to start working with Witwer now, knowing that they are two separate entities, right? Clearly, it's also made clear that this guy Fleming, right, who they basically have knocked out in their airplane here, that he was working for Kaplan, right? And so they planned that big car crash, trying to kind of make him feel like there was a police agency that was working to protect him, but clearly it was the army trying to basically take control of the situation the whole time here, right, with Kaplan at the head. And I think it's to get in the way of that fidelity, right, that a man has toward his wife, that one person has toward a companion here. Remember, we talk about Witwer. The idea of being a widower is you probably miss your companion. You long for them. You would do anything to have them back. And here we have this old fat guy, right, basically trying to dispose of the one woman that's a part of John's life. And it says here, it seemed strange that Anderton waited so long. He's literally watching Lisa get choked, right? But then he snaps into action. And I'll just read this. Fleming's thick fingers, there's the fatness, right? To tie us back to that basic line, old, fat, and bald, right? Cruelly embedded in the woman's pale flesh. Cruelly really stands out, right? It makes us think of a type of human being within the world. And then that is when John basically hits him with the gun, right? Brings it back on his skull, and then those monstrous hands relax. And there are the hands of a monster, but at the same time, we have to remember it's the hands of a human being, right? That would choose to do this to a woman, right? Here on this airplane. And the idea of monsters could be the unfortunate state of old men, right? What they become is monsters, right? As essentially kind of demonstrated by this scene. And so I think by the end of section 7 here, it's pretty clear. It is the army versus the police, right? And these are two disparate forces that are at odds with each other. All right, so we enter into section 8 of the story, and right off the bat, we're waiting for John and Lisa as they return. And a small detail that kind of repeats at least once or twice in the that repeats twice, maybe a few times in the story, is a cloud of escort ships dipped their fins and sped off. And I think sometimes Philip K. Dick will go out of his way to create that connection to an animal of some kind. In this case, it could be a dolphin, it could be a fish. If it is a fish, I think sometimes it could be an allusion to the Christian fish and the idea of a certain kind of change, something along the lines of Christ here that has maybe been complete. And we have kind of a new John that has returned, right? With a set of realizations that are different from his prior life. And that's how we maybe start off section 8 here. All right. He corrects himself a little lamely. Lamely, I think, is an important word to use here because it brings a certain self-awareness to this situation. He understands he can make mistakes, right? That he is incapable at times. Here is maybe, there's still many pages to go here, but maybe this is where John and Witwer seem to bury the strife between them because they kind of explain it. Witwer has to, is kind of disgusted by the idea that John thinks he's trying to get his job, and he says, plotting to get your job. And plotting is interesting because it does speak to the idea of premeditation, right? That we are configuring, right, a game plan, something that we can get ahead with. In this case, it could be murder, right? Trying to off somebody. But plotting speaks to premeditation. And John's reply to that, right? I'm fearful that you are plotting to get my job is, I'm plotting to try to keep my job. So it kind of nullifies, right? Or it kind of neutralizes that whole sense of conflict between them. We're all guilty of this thing, right? We're all trying to protect what we have, and that could be the situation of old men like I've alluded to before, right? Especially as you recognize that you are becoming less and less capable in life, you're trying to protect everything around you. I think that speaks to the beautiful home that we find Kaplan in, another old man, in the war-devastated countryside, right? We will try to hold on to these things at all costs. A certain kind of living, a certain stature within our society. And here, I think what's also given to us, and I think pretty straightforward, I think it's, Philip K. Dick just wants to make some of the motives clear. What is the army trying to do here as they use John as an example of why pre-crime doesn't work? And so the army kind of starts to use this to their advantage. Their intention is to take over total control. No more relegating certain tasks, responsibilities, power to the two different agencies. The pre-crime will be wiped out completely, and the army will take over, not just in the kind of global sense, but in the societal sense as well, which I think we have to be reminded that does describe some societies out there, right, where the army is essentially the major power and control. And that's what this would be, right? That's essentially, and I think that's why the army seems to be the most antagonistic force by far, right, in the text, is because they seem to have a pretty cruel objective here, right, which is to essentially dominate, right, dominate society. We're reflecting on pre-crime and the conflicts with the army that he's currently learning about, just realizing he has a lot of responsibility, right, as he takes over leadership of this agency. But he's nice enough to even say, I'm going to be taking over this is crazy. But then he says, not immediately, of course, right? And I think that might be a nod to Anderton. Have it until you want it. Take your time, right? I'm not here to completely usurp you and push you out so quickly. I'm more gracious than that, right? Truly. And I think we see that. There's so much distrust and animosity built up early on because of his fear of younger people, that he can be replaced so easily. But what we've seen between Lisa and Witwer is these are actually pretty good characters. There's really not too many faults we can speak to, especially in terms of like ill nature or something like that. Now, moving into the next part here, there's a lot of description of the data tapes, right, that are produced by the pre-cogs here. And the first one that is described is going to be Jerry's, right? And I'll just describe it quick. This is kind of interesting. What happens in this time path, right? This foreseeable future for this precog. John essentially is taken to Kaplan's villa. So kind of like we saw in the story earlier, right? Where he's kind of kidnapped, taken to this place. And it is the organization GHQ of the International Veterans League, that group that we heard about earlier, kind of that old boy military club. And there, John is given a ultimatum. You either end pre-crime, especially with somebody with that leadership capacity, he can do that, or you're going to face open hostilities with the army, which is pretty vague, but it don't sound good, right? I don't think you really want to, you want to avoid that if you can. Well, in that same time path, John tries to maybe deal with this responsibly, who knows, but he goes to the Senate to get help in this conflict between the police and the military people here, but the Senate does not help them. And so they actually get rid of the police system, right? They dismember the police system. They give the army full control. And in that context, it's almost like I've had enough. He takes a corps, John takes a corps of fanatic police. And I think fanatic is an interesting word here, because it allows us to think about people who break the rules. There's a weird moment coming up after something happens. I won't say it now. But John is seen almost like a celebrity. Even before it happens, John is seen as like a celebrity, right? Because he's in the news. He's supposed to murder somebody. Everybody's got their eye out on him. Remember, nobody's seen a murder in like a very long time. So they look at him almost like a superstar, right? Like a celebrity. And that's why we get the word, I think, fanatic here. People who are following John because of a certain idea that he stands for, right? But he takes a group of fanatic police, goes and finds Kaplan and shoots him dead. And some other men who all survive. And that coup that John leads there is a success, right? That's a crazy time path, right? What a future to be involved in. But it is murder, right? Now the next one, that was Jerry's. The next one that comes down is Donna. And Mike and Donna have like the same output, but then there's something that seems to be off between the two of those. As it says here, the Mike report was quite different from the Donna report. Now I'll just say, and I'll keep going on here, but it gets confusing. I think you got to reread some of these pages here if you're trying to really understand the detail of what's being provided here in terms of the time pass, right? The readouts, the visions, whatever you want to call them, that are provided by these precogs. So you can reread it a little bit just to get a better sense. However, I'll just mention this. Donna's time path speaks to John's premeditated murder of Kaplan. Obviously, if you have a coup and you go somewhere and you got somebody as your target, that's all very premeditated, right? Of Kaplan, so John is premeditating on the murder of Kaplan, right? And Kaplan, on a symbolic level, represents something to do with old and manly, which may be patriarchy. I don't think I've said that word enough throughout the text, but when we saw the overbearing nature of Fleming, right? The way he was digging those chubby hands into Lisa's neck, I think you see that male aggression, right, kind of pouring out. And a lot of other Philip K. Dick literature is going to deal with those themes of male versus female and patriarchy and resisting and kind of, combating those forms of control. But just to mention those things, right? And maybe he's disposing of this for women's sake, right? He does have Lisa to be thinking about, right? And so maybe he's doing that work here by eliminating Kaplan. It says here, they're going to demand the Senate disband us, meaning the police and pre-crime involved, which is a part of the police, and take away our authority. They're going to claim we've been arresting innocent men, nocturnal police raids, that sort of thing, rule by terror. And what the army is going to claim the police are doing are behaving like the SS, right? Taking people away before, they've actually done anything wrong, totally kind of mistreating them and their rights, right? So I think that's what they're saying, is the army will just lay that claim upon us, right? That we're going to be acting just like what sounds like kind of the SS, right? Some of these horrible police forces that we've seen throughout time. And what John kind of comes to this conclusion here is he needs to kill Kaplan because it's the only way to preserve pre-crime and perhaps the police agency in the first place. Now that he kind of sees the bigger picture here, the fact that the police could be completely overrided, disbanded, right, completely vanish, now he knows he really has to protect the agency, right? Remember we talked about that. Lisa brought up that ultimatum. What's more important, you or the system that you come from, or the organization that you're trying to protect? And I think here he understands, I have to protect the police force, right? I've read quite a few Philip K. Dick stories, and I can't say that a lot of them center on this idea of police versus army, but I like it because it does make you think about the real examples of that throughout history, right? Where these have really been in conflict with one another. And at the end of this section 8, Witwer's like, so the minority report is incorrect, right? Because you say you're going to kill Kaplan, and Anderton says, no, it's correct, but I'm still going to murder Kaplan anyhow, right? So he's kind of going against the futures that are being predicted within those time paths, which almost, I think at the end of the day, if you follow this through and through, it feels like you're in control of your actions, right? Because every single time path is just superseded by the next one to come out. And I guess if you're privy to that information, or at least who you are as a human being, perhaps, right, just to completely generalize it, then you have a chance, right, to make the right decision. And maybe the moment is in your hands, right? And everybody can make these decisions for themselves. All right, section 9. The irony, of course, of being a police commissioner for a very long time, 30 years, and then never seeing a man killed, right, because of this pre-crime system that John even himself would say maybe is not very accurate, right? We might be putting people away that really had alternate paths in mind, right? Different things could have happened. But of course we have this data and we're going to act upon it. So as John is milling through the crowd here, it reads, nobody paid the slightest attention to him. Just to keep reminding you of the irony of that, he was once a police chief. Everybody knew who he was, right? He was a very important person, but now he's this Ernest Temple, right? He's got this new identity, which allows him to really use the crowds to his advantage. He can blend in with the people. He is of the people, and I think the people themselves, as we get into the last couple pages of the story, are almost a character in themselves, right? They seem to be very important. The way they observe and perceive these crazy events that are occurring on stage. We really think about the crowds here and their perspective and what they represent. Here's a very good line to support that idea of John just being engulfed in the masses here. As Anderton made his way through the dense mob, he was engulfed by the solid presence of humanity. Again, reminding us that he was kind of keeping himself from this and passing judgments upon a humanity that maybe weren't all that accurate after all, and yet here he is still standing by pre-crime, right, as we get further on in the text. But anyways, he is totally a part of this at this point, which I think is a part of his ultimate transformation, right, to be of the people here, not something that is completely separate from it. And there we have Kaplan on stage. He's got his cane, which I think just represents the idea of old age and the support that's needed here, but it's still propping him up there, right, for everybody to see. It says here Kaplan had got his old uniform from its mothballs. He really got out one of the most splendid military uniforms he could get. And I think the proper term here is regalia, right? When you start to see the shoulder pads and all the you know, medals and all the other kind of insignia that we have draping right off of these military individuals. There's a lot of time and effort, concern, and detail that goes into it, right? And some people might even say maybe too much, who knows? But he's surrounded by very similar types of military staff here as well, right? They're all there. Even a decorative short sword, right? Just to really kind of, you know, remind us of the traditionalism wound up in the military here, the rank and the rank and file and all that stuff. And the last part of this is truly, I think, the most important, right? Which is, we know Kaplan is old. We know he represents the idea of being old. And however he is transformed, it says here, it was amazing how transformed a bald man became under the stark potency of an officer's peaked and visored cap. Potency meaning virility, right? The ability to have children. So it is speaking to a certain patriarchy that longs to continue. And it can continue in this shelter, right, of a military environment where we all have seen men have had complete dominating control and still do throughout the world, right? Not much really has changed in hundreds and hundreds of years. And it is amazing, right, how even old men who fail in so many other ways, right, especially in terms of energy and capability and the physical body, right, that they carry with them every day, it is amazing that once they put on those uniforms, a certain power, a certain kind of influence, right, really does come with it. And I think that's why we have such an emphasis on that transformation here for Kaplan. At the end, it really shows you kind of what he represents. Here we do have John saying, "Give me that package," to Kaplan. The package would be a copy of one of those time paths, right, taken from one of the Pre-cogs. The one that basically shows that that John would not do it, right? That John was not going to do it. And then I think package is kind of interesting, knowing we're talking about patriarchy here, and knowing that we're talking about John, who seems to contest with Kaplan, with Fleming throughout the text, taking back a sense of masculinity or what could be patriarchy, and then being in a position of control with that. So I think that could be it, what he's taking away from Kaplan here at the very end. And then they start talking, and Kaplan says, "You don't mind being an example, right, for the end of pre-crime." And of course, we know that sorry, I keep on saying Jerry, Kindly Isle, right? I was teaching that not too long ago, so I think that name is just on my tongue. But John, he kind of goes along with it at first, right? That's fine, right? This is going to be the way that it all goes down. We get a little bit of that omniscient narration here, as it says in regards to Kaplan, his uncertainty grew as Anderton willingly mounted the steps of the platform. He's starting to have his doubts. Yes, he's seen the certain data, right, that his life will be spared, that John chose to do something different, right? But at the same time, he's starting to have his doubts here. And that kind of is a nice way of putting us right back in the head of John. What is John thinking, right, in this crucial moment? Now, here's where it's really strange. Avidly, I'll just read, avidly, they being the crowd, right, the crowd that's amassed here. They peered at the only potential killer they had ever been privileged to see at close range. That's very counterintuitive. We wouldn't think we have the privilege to see to see a killer on stage. In fact, it would maybe be the opposite. It would be a privilege to see somebody who's morally astounding, right? Who has such an amazing track record and can speak to that. That's would be the privilege. So the language is strange here. It's a privilege to see a killer. But maybe this is just that it's a privilege to see somebody who would go against these rules, right, that we have within our society, and somebody who's going to take that risk. But that is strange, right? The diction of privileged is a little strange. I like this. Kaplan his intention being to discredit pre-crime, is just talking about how innocent John Allison Anderton is. And he says, John Allison Anderton is innocent of any crime in the past, present, and future. And that almost just seems so all-encompassing and almost too good to be true, right? To say that this man will never do anything horrible, right? Any crime. It just seems like unrealistic when you think about people's lives and the things that do occur, right? And the decisions that some people do choose, right? And the actions they take. So that's pretty interesting. The way Kaplan describes this too is, as he discredits pre-crime, he calls it a penal system based on a false premise. There could be some way of looking at that from an old, like, Protestant religious perspective, where they believed, what was it? Some of the terms escape me in the moment, but that from the moment you were born, you were destined for hell, right? And to be in the elect, right? In these groups, there was no guarantee of it. And so it was crazy. You were told you were going to a place, a penal system. You could call it a prison. We can call it hell. You can call it whatever you want, without actually committing those crimes in advance, right? So it is kind of talking about just the strange nature of all that. Maybe it reminds us of some old Puritan forms of Christianity. They're discussing these philosophical ideas, right? If no arrests had been made, there would still have been no crimes committed. Because again, it's no guarantee, right? If they would have, based on the example of John that's being shared here with the crowd. The crowd is listening with, it says, great interest. And I think that's where we understand the importance of the crowd. It is humanity. Humanity is going to listen with a very, very, very keen interest here, because they want to know how our decisions and the actions we take affect notions of salvation, right? And perhaps, what comes after all of this. So yeah, I think of course they're interested, the general crowd, right? It's basically the global community who subscribes to religion on a daily basis. That could be the crowd that's taking interest here. Now, here we have Kaplan. He's got the reports, right? So he's got the data that explains all of these future occurrences. And it says here, his lean, bony fingers groped for the summary of the first, Donna, and after that, Mike. And groped is never really a good word to use, especially in terms of sexual assault, right? And Philip K. Dick does this with other literature as well, especially Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, because that's a big theme that's kind of explored in that text. Bony fingers almost makes it feel like death, right? Something decaying, almost ready to be disposed of. And groping for Donna. And why is that important? Because Donna represents woman, right? So groping woman. Why is that validated, that idea of a certain kind of assault against woman? Well, we saw an assault against a woman earlier in the text with Lisa and that Mr. Fleming, right? So it is a certain domination, a certain physical violence toward women. And I think what I love about this story is the main character, John, starts to stand up against that. He's kind of taking on those forces, those greater forces within the world, based on the role he's playing, his protection of Lisa, him working with his wife throughout the story. So as he's reading the final report there, that's when he basically reads the fact that John does kill him, right? I think that's what he sees, because what does he do as soon as he opens this up and he's going to read this with everybody, right? He's putting on this big kind of spectacle. But instead, he just runs away, right? He looks like a trapped animal, which takes us back to, I think, instincts and who we are as animals and the fear that kicks in. He's ready to run away because he knows he's about to get killed. Earlier, ironically, John was ready to run away because he had information that he was going to be the one doing a killing, right? So it's completely reversed here. But it still speaks to the idea of like the predator and the prey that we are as human beings, right? What side of that do we tend to fall? Do we tend to be a part of? And he is the cornered animal here, and he's ready to get away. And what does John do? This is crazy part of the story. And I don't think this would work in the film at all, because it's just so abrupt and there's just not enough more action in the story, right? But it is a crazy ending. He literally just shoots him, right? He shoots him twice, and that's it. I'll read some of the language here. Kaplan, his thin chest was a smoking cavity of darkness, crumbling ash that broke loose as the body lay twitching. Oof, pretty detailed there. Thin chest, right? Something that was brittle, especially because we've blasted through the uniform, the military uniform, right? That once you got through that, what you're really noticing is the thin chest of an old man, right? Who's trying desperately to hold on to some form of power, or at least maybe even expanding that power, right? As we see in their overall intentions here. So you got to think about the symbolism overall here at the end. John kills Kaplan. And what that means is he saved pre-crime, right? Because this was predicted by the system, right? And he has followed through, maybe even in a very authentic way. But what he's also done, when you think about what Kaplan represents, is he has defended women from a ghastly, overstated, and over-endured patriarchy that has had its grip on women for millennium, right, when you really start to break it down. And Kaplan's thin chest, once again, representing that frailty of this type of man, perhaps, in the world, who has had so much sway and so much power. He falls off the platform, which is really to fall in status. So a second character, we saw John go through it. John kind of bounces back, of course, as this wonderful protagonist, but Kaplan, he's off the stage. That is a fall from status that will not reverse itself, right? Now, there's a sentence at the end of this paragraph. It says, "It would take time for acceptance to replace blind terror," and that's really in regards to the audience. To mention the audience here, this is all of humanity. They're such an important group here at the end. And initially, this blind terror, the terror of army brutality, but also police brutality. This is John, a policeman who's just gone boom, right, blam. He's showing them a murder, pretty vicious one, that they haven't seen in a very long time. I guess it's like 30 years. So there's going to be this kind of like terror initially, right, that they see. But what will come later as they get used to this, and that's the sad part, the conditioning of this type of society, right, perhaps. That's why, you know, how good do we feel about a pre-crime agency, despite the fact that John and Lisa are like safe and stuff like that. But how good do we feel about pre-crime when they've been likened to almost like a Gestapo unit, right? And night interrogations and holding people against their will, and some of the other things that the small details that are mentioned there. How great do we feel about an organization like this now really establishing some kind of control? Maybe for John, he did it to prove there are monsters in the world, and that monsters rule through terror and hostility, because we get this line at the end of that section, section 9. Somebody says, "the poor devil," almost like a sympathetic way of saying someone, you know, regarding someone awful, and it's out of sympathy. And Anderton doesn't know if that is a comment meant for Kaplan or himself. And I guess we can just make it easy and say probably both of them. Kaplan, I think we've already covered, you know, the reasons he could be likened to some kind of, let's say, evil, right, or detrimental force within the world. But John, as well, right, to show that monsters, again, do exist within this world. And maybe he is fulfilling that kind of role here at the end. And he gets what he wants, which is to be transported to Centaurus X by intersystem transport, right? A long trip for an old man. And to the text here, I think it was a struggle in between older age and still having that potency in life, right? Physically, in terms of how you are regarded, right? Your capabilities. Now, I think it's time to go out to pasture And that seems to be the way it ends for John here, right? He's going off, he has to go away. He's essentially exiled, right, is what he's getting because of what he's done to this army general. And he gets to bring Lisa with him. There you go, right? Lisa's going to be with him the whole way. Centaurus X is, I think, Centaur. I think it's half man, half animal. And that's where he's going off as this kind of constant reminder of the duality of what we are as human beings, right? We are this kind of advanced intellectual pursuit of right and wrong and how we treat these difficult matters within the world, but we are also animals. And so I think that's what this is all about, is how we mediate, right? This reality versus this necessity, right? To try to find some kind of balance in all of this. Because we are animals nonetheless, and that's always going to make things a lot more complicated. Small thing here, but it could be telling. Lisa is wearing a sweater and slacks, and she roamed through the barren rooms. Barren could be the barren rooms of Earth, right? We talk about the destruction that we've seen in the society in terms of war, right? We're given that evidence. Sweater and slacks I love. Slacks is on equal kind of status as a man. I can do those things too. I can be physically aggressive and effective when I need to be, right? And perhaps we see a little bit of that throughout the story, but not your typical woman. I think they are truly kind of a partnership, right? John and Lisa. And we seem to end that way as well. And even as it ends, like kind of one of the last things we hear between them is, she says, "No regrets. Now suppose you help me with this crate." John helping her, her helping him, right? This kind of equal measure that we see in that relationship, which is just a wonderful thing, truly, right, in this story. So they start discussing a little bit more detail about the time paths between, or from the three different pre-cogs and the idiots, as they're called so many times throughout the text. And Donna's and Jerry's are similar, but the reason they seem to be different is the motive, right? Which is a big part of premeditation. Why did you do it, right? The motives are different. In the first one, it just seems like once he learns of Kaplan's plot, he promptly murders him, right? It's just quick. In the second one, maybe there's just a different reason provided. He just wanted to keep his job, right? That was the most important thing. You're going to end pre-crime? No, you're not. I'm going to have to dispose of you, right? And that was the reasoning. So that seems to be the only major difference there. And then he really just tersely kind of wraps it up, maybe too quickly. But he basically just says, because there's always like a new report that's being produced by the pre-cogs, it just invalidates the last one, right? So it just seems to be an endless cycle of that. And that's kind of what we're left with at the very end. Lisa is, I think, very deliberately described as lithe and agile. That is to contrast nicely with the fat that we've seen in all these other characters throughout the text here. Maybe these kind of patriarchal forces, right, that we have. And it says, of the three, Mike was correct. You know, Mike, let's just talk about the names here at the end a little bit. Maybe it would be helpful at the end to talk about the names, maybe a little bit easier. But Donna, of course, is woman, right? Jerry, as said earlier, is like to rule through spear, right? And if you have to ascribe that to a gender, it's probably going to be male, right? Because it represents military and combat and fighting, you know, with powerful strength. Mike is Michael, which is the Archangel Michael, and that is really like the most devoted, strongest angel to God in heaven. And so it represents the power and devotion, right? And the will for God, right? So maybe that's what it is. The most important is Mike, which is the power of God. And maybe that's the way we have to understand what impacts John's decisions throughout the story, right? There is this kind of ethic or moral consideration throughout that we maybe can tie to the power of God, or maybe just some level of devotion, right, that you cannot give up on. But it says, since no report came after his, to invalidate him, right? And that's it. Mike was the last one, and therefore Mike is correct. At the very end, it's a happy ending, except for maybe some of the things we've mentioned, like the real nature of pre-crime and the police agencies, and maybe they are worse than the army would have been. I mean, who knows, right? But he is willing to move on with Lisa, who seems devoted by his side. Also, he's not scared of Witwer, but rather informative, helpful, and pretty sincere. Witwer left almost in a widowed state, in the sense that he has no one to help him. John and Lisa are both leaving at the end. So I think it's Witwer we truly worry about, because he's going to have the task of keeping this pre-crime thing going, knowing that the army is hostile, right, to what they're doing. He has a lot on his plate to deal with. John seems happy and relieved to pass this on to the next man. And I think at the end here, Witwer almost, in a sense, ages, because he's going to have to be the one to deal with this now, right? Just like John has for many, many, many years. But he's happy to pass this on to the next man who is rising up, because that next man will become the new target, right? And he can step away from that. So he ends in Centaurian X, the land of men and horses, our vitality, our need to remain relevant. Maybe that's what it represents. And of course, he does have Lisa by his side, an oath to God. Don't forget about his redemptive journey throughout this text that we do see. He is an old man, and he has usurped Kaplan, right? So he has eliminated Kaplan here. John has many possessions that he's bringing with him. And I think that speaks to being this important figure, right, for 30-some years and kind of disconnected from the majority of society. He's just collected a lot of stuff. He has a lot of crap. And I think that just kind of represents, how much he's accumulated, how much he's benefited from this lifestyle over the years. And lastly, John admits to the ludicrousness of pre-crime philosophy and methodology. And he says that's all it ever was, is an illusion. Because I guess the idea is you can always change, right, some kind of forecasted future, right? At least if you are privy to the information, right? Which John truly is, right? Being the actual commissioner. Thank you so much. I don't think I can go back and watch the movie anymore, because then I'm just going to get so confused, right? Because they are so different. But the story itself is really good. And it's just another very imaginative story from one of the best who's ever done it. Thank you, and I hope you have a beautiful day.